Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today to mark 1 year of Boris Johnson's premiership. It's incredible that it has already been a year, though I'm sure many of us will agree this hasn't been fun for anyone. Today we're really lucky to be joined by leading experts on Islamophobia, the Conservative Party and British Muslim identity, Miqdaad Versi, Peter Oborne and Dr Khadijah Elshayyal. This event will very much be an open conversation between our panellists about this last year and all that this has meant for Muslims and in terms of Islamophobia. Please do get involved in the conversation yourselves. Our panellists will be taking your questions. Please do send any questions through via the chat facility here on Zoom, and I'll direct as many of these as we have time for to our panellists. I'd just like to remind everyone that this is being recorded. It will be uploaded onto YouTube and it's currently being live streamed onto Facebook. Audience members are encouraged to submit any questions via the chat facility. And for more information on the work of the Muslim Council of Britain and our work on Islamophobia in political parties, please visit mcb.org.uk, follow us on Twitter @Muslim Council or on Facebook or Instagram @Muslim Council UK. I'd now like to introduce our host, Miqdaad Versi. Miqdaad is a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain, and he has been the most outspoken critic of conservative Islamophobia and its failure to tackle this. Miqdaad is well known for his forensic Twitter threads detailing the abhorrent actions of Conservative MPs, councillors and members in propagating hate against Muslims, as well as for all of his work in highlighting the inaccurate reporting of Muslims and Islam in the media. I'll now hand over to Miqdaad.
Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are really lucky to have two fantastic panelists here, Peter Oborne and Dr Khadijah Elshayyal. Brilliant people on this topic who really understand what's going on and can really give insights. Peter, as many of you will be aware, is a prominent journalist and author and broadcaster. He's the former chief political commentator at the Daily Telegraph, yes, the same Boris Telegraph as people talk about it more recently, and he's now a columnist at Middle East Eye and has authored a number of books on politics, political figures and cricket. He's also sat as a commissioner for the Citizens Commission on Islam Participation in Public Life. And he's been committed to exposing the plague of racism in the Conservative Party, consistently criticizing the party for its failings in this space, particularly on Islamophobia. At the last election in 2019, Peter Oborne famously wrote that Boris Johnson wants to destroy the Britain I love. I cannot vote Conservative, despite having voted Conservative for most of his life, if not all of his life actually, citing a number of reasons, including Johnson's lack of appetite to deal with the virulent Islamophobia that poisons the party. Dr Khadijah Elshayyal is a postdoctoral research fellow at Edinburgh University's Al-Walid Centre for the study of Islam in the contemporary world. She is one of the leading specialists on Muslims in Britain and the author of the well-renowned Muslim Identity Politics book, Islam Activist and Equality in Britain. And she also authored Scottish Muslims in Numbers, Understanding Scotland's Muslims through the 2011 census. In her work, she's highlighted and warned about the rise of divisive and far-right politics and growing Islamophobia in Britain and the challenges this poses for Muslims, particularly Muslim advocacy organizations and activists. Before we get a chance to hear from our esteemed panel and our experts, I thought it would be a great opportunity to just set the scene a little bit about what's happened in the last year. Many of the people who are here in the audience and others will be aware that when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, there were a number of concerns from Muslim communities, not least because of some of his comments, whether it is his comments about Muslim women who wear the niqab looking like letterboxes and bank robbers, statements after which we had a rise in hate crime against Muslim women, whether it is the fact that he has previously said things like it is only natural for people to be scared of Islam, or claimed that the problem is Islam is the problem, or when he defended Islamophobia as a natural reaction. Many of these comments have led to many people thinking that Boris Johnson has a certain challenge when it comes to Islam and Muslims. But these are things that we, as Muslim communities, have to recognize as the Prime Minister of our country, what that means for us. And many people came together to understand and think about what that might mean for Muslim communities over the last year. In particular, given the specific problem of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. We have had a year where, in this last year, there's been an election where the Conservative Party has gained a majority, where we've had the COVID crisis. But in parallel to that, there has been a growth in the questions surrounding the party when it comes to Islamophobia. In particular, we have seen how the party in its early stages said that when Boris Johnson was on a panel with Sajid Javid and others, was asked very clearly whether he would launch an independent inquiry into Islamophobia, and he said yes. The scale of the problem is very well known. We have over 300 cases and examples of Islamophobia and anti-Islam sentiment identified within the party, within the Muslim Council of Britain's submission to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And the scale of the problem is very, very well documented. Just today, we have seen a member of parliament who has previously retweeted Tommy Robinson, who has previously hosted one of the biggest anti-Muslim extremists in the world in parliament, who has shared Facebook posts, anti-Muslim Facebook posts, who has been in anti-Muslim Facebook groups, who has done a large number of things that have caused huge concern to Muslim communities. And today he was exposed as someone who had been on a panel with Katie Hopkins and David Vance, people who very many would recognize as serious Islamophobes in this space. Now, given all of that, you'd have assumed that with that longer history, some action would be taken against this one individual. But no, no action has been taken. And it seems to be the case that the Conservative Party seems to sweep under the rug any concern about Islamophobia. The former chair of the Conservative Party, Miqdaad Versi, who understands the ins and outs of the party, having been there, having understood and spoken to many of these individuals, she has spoken out and said how she believes that their response of the Conservative Party is one of PR and media alignment rather than actually wanting to deal with the problem of Islamophobia. And when you have a situation where the governing party of this country is accused of a type of racism that is prevalent in our society and is accused of doing nothing to tackle it, and instead seems to be acting in a way that perpetuates it within its own party, there is a serious problem. A nice anecdote, which I think is really interesting, which highlights some of the challenges that we're talking about, is the issue of Islamophobia and its definition. Many people will be aware that the APPG of British Muslims has come up and developed a definition of Islamophobia that has been adopted by hundreds of Muslim organizations across the country, as well as all the main political parties other than the Conservatives. Of course, any party has the right to decide how it wants to treat any type of racism. But the Conservative Party specifically, when asked why it has not adopted this definition of Islamophobia, only a few months ago, the minister in the House of Lords who responded said, yes, Muslims might have said this, that this definition is the right thing for their communities, but guess what? I've been listening to the Henry Jackson Society, to Policy Exchange, to Barnabas Fund, and to Civitas, and they seem to think it's problematic. And just imagine, these are four organizations which have a history of anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Muslim behavior, and problematic articles and reports which have been shown to be incorrect and false about Muslims. And yet they are the ones who the Conservative Party and the government are listening to when it comes to issues to do with Muslims. Not Muslim organizations, not Muslim representatives themselves, and not Muslims who really understand what's going on. What we have is a challenge as Muslim civil society to see how do we deal with this problem in our society as a whole. Many of us will be aware of the scale of Islamophobia in this country. We have over a third of the population who think that British Muslims would support policies to reduce the number of Muslims in this country. In fact, over 31% of young children, these are even young children, this is a survey between the ages of 10 and 14, think that Muslims are taking over England. How can this be the case in modern Britain? In fact, the Equality and Human Rights Commission found out that 70% of Muslims in the last year had experienced some form of religious-based prejudice in 2018, which is a couple of years ago. The scale of the problem is clear. It's not just about hate crime, it's about the structural problems within media, within politicians, within our society as a whole, within the outcomes that we see in education, health, and others, where Islamophobia is so prevalent. But we're talking here about the Conservative Party in particular. And what we see is that there is a specific and particular here. We know, for example, that 2/3 of Conservative Party members, these are paid members of the Conservative Party, believe that the Islamophobic far-right conspiracy that parts of the UK are under Sharia law. That's not the case. Nearly half prefer not to have a Muslim prime minister, but will be happy with those of other faiths. More than half of those Conservative Party members surveyed think that Islam is generally a threat to the British way of life. I mean, when you look at these figures, it is not a small section. It is prevalent. When it comes to even the Conservative Party supporters and voters, 42% of Conservative Party voters believe that Tommy Robinson highlights issues ignored by the media. And 27% of them believe that Muslim immigration to this country is part of a bigger plan to make Muslims the majority of this country's population. That is a real challenge. 27% of Conservative Party members think this. If that is what the membership think, and that's what the voters think who vote for the Conservative Party, it leaves a real challenge politically on what we should do. Now, with that background, that long background, I think it's really important for us to have the opportunity of hearing from some of those who would understand this topic much better. And I'd like to start with Peter Oborne, as a Conservative Party supporter for most of your life, as a chief political commentator for the Daily Telegraph, which is the host of many of Boris Johnson's columns before he became Prime Minister, as someone who understands the Conservative Party very well. I'd like to ask you and start with you and say, what's your view of the challenges that we've seen in the last year when it comes to Islamophobia in the Conservative Party and broadly when it comes to Tory Islamophobia? Can we unmute? Sorry, Peter, can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thank you.
I apologize for that. And by the way, thank you very much for all the outstanding work you've done in exposing the nature of this problem inside the Conservative Party. It's been a lonely job you've had to do. You haven't had the support from the bulk of the media. You've come under great attack, I've seen in places. Yet you've carried on, and it's a noble task you're doing to bring fairness into public discourse in this country. And that's all we're talking about. We're just simply saying, can Muslims please be treated in the same way that all minorities and everybody in this country should expect to be treated, and shouldn't be insulted, abused, and all of these other things, which are not unique to Muslims, but it's a very bad, it's not what Britain is about. It's a fair, decent country. And that's why I'm concerned about this. And I'm particularly concerned with the Conservative Party, which I been a long-term student of. I know the people at the top of the party quite well. I understand the party. I think I've attended all 30 of their last 30 party conferences. And it's, what you're seeing at the moment, I fear, is a move from being the decent, pragmatic party, which was the party of John Major and even very largely of Theresa May, and certainly of David Cameron in the early years. And you're moving towards something which is being an alt-right party, or at any rate a continental far-right party on the lines which you have in Fidesz in Hungary. And on the continent with the far-right movements there. There's some of the figures which you produced were completely shocking. More than 50%, I think, of Conservative Party members believe the conspiracy theory that there are parts of Britain with Sharia law. This is the sort of nonsense which gets pumped out on Fox News in the United States, and it's just and that more than half the membership of the Conservative Party. Now, when Mr. Johnson ran for the Tory leadership, I sent from Middle East Eye a questionnaire to all the people running for the leadership about their views on Islamophobia. All of the other contenders, Jeremy Hunt, Rory Stewart, and others, sent in a replied, but we didn't get any reply from Johnson. And then we had the promise to have an independent inquiry into Islamophobia after the in the run-up to the election? Well, I think a lot does depend on that independent inquiry, because there's an enormous amount to look at in terms of the investigations into really abusive and terrible comments made by party members and some MPs, of which the latest you've mentioned something else this morning I wasn't aware of. And there's a tolerance of bigotry which is completely foreign to the Conservative Party tradition, it should be said. It's Conservative Party is about decency and pragmatism and tolerance, and not about bigotry and allowing that kind of conduct. And so there's a major issue. And one of the reasons the final point I would make is it isn't being properly dealt with, is because much of the press, British press, shares that right-wing Islamophobic bigotry with the Conservative Party members who read them.
Thank you, Peter. Not the most optimistic view of what's happening, but the reality of the challenges that we unfortunately face. Dr. Khadijah, you obviously, as someone who has looked at the Muslims in Britain broadly. I mean, you've written a book on it. You've followed this topic very well, and you're a commentator who regularly shares public views on what's happening when it comes to British Muslims. How do you see this? You have obviously you've looked at this for many years, given that your book was written a couple of years ago, I think, and it must have taken a while to write it as well. How do you think it's changed? Do you think now we're in a good situation, a better situation, a worse situation? What do you think are the challenges that are facing Muslims, and in particular, how should Muslims respond? I mean, we have a government. The government has the ability to make change. The government has the power to tackle issues that face Muslim communities. So how do we best engage in this topic? And more broadly, what are your thoughts? I mean, open floor for you.
Thank you. I also want to start off by actually following Peter's lead and paying tribute to yourselves, and in particular to yourself, Miqdaad, and also to the Centre for Media Monitoring at the MCB for, as Peter said, it is a thankless task that you guys do, but also I would extend that to thankless sort of within our communities as well. I think not many people actually appreciate the amount of work that that goes into just assiduously, constantly monitoring things and keeping abreast of really sort of the actual, I would go as far as saying danger and harm that's being perpetrated in our public spaces and our media and our political spaces. And it's a job that if nobody did it, we'd all be complaining, but somebody's doing it, and everyone sort of relies on the one or two people that are pushing things along. But it's such a valuable task that you guys do, and thanks so much for having me today. So on the government today, I think I think we're in a very dire situation, but I wouldn't say it's my personal view is it's not super exceptional. I think I can see, if you trace back even from New Labour days, even from sort of beyond that, Margaret Thatcher, sort of prior to that, it's sort of a trajectory that I think that's been followed in the political establishment in terms of dealing with Muslim minorities. I mean, there've been ups and downs, but I think the current sort of situation is probably the direst that I've seen. And in terms of engagement with the state, I think it's a strange one. I think I want to start off by saying, actually, maybe one of the things that's often leveled at groups like the MCB or sort of Muslim activists in general is, why are you constantly engaging in the political sphere with your faith on your sleeve? Why are you obsessed with this identity politics? Why are you obsessed with your faith? Why can't you just be a citizen like everybody else? And actually, I would always respond to that by saying, well, actually, why are Muslims constantly being exceptionalized in the public sphere? I mean, the reason why people are responding as Muslims is because they're facing barriers and discrimination and prejudice from the establishment structurally, but also filtering out into the everyday on the basis of their faith and on the basis of racialization of their identity and of their faith identity, or other aspects of their ethnic minority backgrounds, or other sort of aspects of diversity. And I think the sort of the most unfair situation that we're facing at the moment is that whenever Muslims come to speak up about this and speak up about the discrimination and the prejudice that they're facing as Muslims, they are pushed away and asked to stop going on about their Muslimness. When this is so it's sort of a they sort of get boxed into the situation where they, you know, they're facing prejudice on the basis of their being Muslim, but then when they speak up about this, they're being told, well, stop going on about your Muslimness. So I would flip this and say, actually, the sort of the people we should be asking not to go on about identity politics are the Conservative Party themselves and the government and the state itself and the institutions that it works through, including the media. And I think that's something we need to consider in particular when we think about power and how that works in our society. So yeah, I guess I'll put that out there for now, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more as the conversation carries on.
Dr. Khadijah, so what do you see? I mean, we've obviously got a very interesting situation right now where there seems to be almost a weaponization of this idea of identity politics or how Muslims engage in the public space. I mean, do you think that we should be highlighting these issues? Like, how do you see the Muslim community response should be? I know there's not one Muslim community, there are lots, you know, we're not homogenized, and talking about one Muslim community really misunderstands the diversity that we face. But as Muslims as a whole, because we are almost classed in that way,
yes.
How should Muslims of any type, of all types, of however, like, how should we respond? I mean, is the right response to still keep on trying to engage and be positive? Do we, you know, should some actually hold back on the criticism and the reality of Islamophobia that we see solely so that we might be able to influence politics in a slightly more positive direction? Like, where does that line get drawn, and how should Muslims engage with this government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to be absolutely blunt again. In terms of drawing a line, it wasn't the Muslim communities who have drawn the line, it's the government which has drawn the line, and a very clear line which has been sort of really underlined and made a lot deeper by the Conservative government during the coalition, following that by David Cameron, and further still by Boris Johnson. And that line is basically a very clear indication that the sort of status quo is that the state will not engage with Muslim activist groups or any Muslim communal representation of any sort, despite the fact that historically it was actually a Conservative government which pushed the Muslim community back in the 1990s to organise themselves on a communal basis, a la Board of Deputies of British Jews. So it's quite interesting to see that it's now another Conservative government which is saying, well, actually, we don't want anything to do with you guys because you are extremists, terrorists, and these are actual accusations that are put out at Muslim groups, you know, and naming them and sort of naming them and sort of tarnishing their reputations in public from Parliament, no less, let alone from sort of high-profile media platforms, things like the Andrew Marr show, amongst others. So the government has drawn the line by saying we will not, the basis is that we will not be engaging with any of these groups except for groups that comply with our policy, okay, that comply with our sort of policy direction, in particular, our securitization policy. Okay, and so what this basically means is that we will only speak to yes men. And this is what we have seen in terms of any kind of public issue that requires engagement. Sort of the most recent one that we've witnessed has been consultation with faith groups around the reopening of places of worship after the pandemic. There's been a very clear indication from the government that they will only be having these conversations with individuals or organisations that are fully on board with the Conservative Party's agenda, and which, to be frank, are not vocal or not vocal in a way that's sort of threatening or radical vis-a-vis Islamophobia in the Conservative Party and Islamophobia systemically, more generally. So in terms of this line, it's already been drawn. It's not something that actually, you know, Muslim organisations have historically tried to engage despite these barriers and despite these constraints that are drawn for them from the state. My personal view is that, as Miqdaad quite rightly you indicated, there isn't, of course, one single homogenous block of Muslims, and as such, there is not a single Muslim organization that can speak for all Muslims, not just in terms of representation to the state, but also in terms of specialism and focus. And I think there are a whole, we all know that there's a whole host, there's a whole range of organizations that focus on all kinds of things. So capacity building, faith institutions, charities, civil rights. There's a whole range of organizations, the arts, right? And all of these do very important work politically, or have the capacity to do that. And I think to restrict ourselves to, I think the days are long gone where we can sort of, as Muslims, restrict ourselves to the constraints that have been drawn out for us by the state. I think rather, I think we really are at a stage where people should have and do have the confidence to set their own agenda. And so if that means making a political impact out with the sort of formal channels of political engagement in the corridors of power, if you like, I think that often that can be far more impactful, in particular at a time where people have basically, are not being given the time of day by the state. So I would say, obviously, it's our right. It's absolutely our right. And as Muslims, as citizens of this country, I wouldn't differentiate us, as Peter says, from anybody else in this country. It's absolutely people's right to seek engagement through official, formal political channels. But I would definitely say, don't restrict yourselves to that. And so much more has been achieved historically if you look at struggles for justice outside of these spaces.
Thank you, Khadijah. Peter, so where do you think this comes from? Why do you think that the Conservative Party seems to have become this sort of hotbed of Islamophobia in many regards? If you look at the percentages, I mean, they're astonishing in terms of how prevalent it's become within the party membership and party voters. And to be honest, within some of the MPs and the types of statements that they've come out with, and potentially even with the Prime Minister. So where do you think this has come from? Is it laziness that has just taken over? Is it more proactive and agenda driven? Is it this idea that people are worried about Islam taking over? Like, where is this coming from, and why has it hit the Conservative Party in particular so hard?
Yes, I think that there is quite a lot of different kinds of answers to this. Although it should be, I do think it's a very serious problem, but I still think that in many ways Britain is a fabulous place for Muslims to live in. I think we're having this conversation. I still think we're a great country, and we can welcome people, of different faiths and beliefs, and be a country which is decent. But there's no doubt at all that there has been a change. Now, I think one of the reasons is that Islamophobia has become a form of racism. I mean, I think that anti-black racism was there's a great battle was fought against that, and there was legislation to outlaw attacks on Islam on the grounds of belief is much more difficult, because you've got to protect the right to criticize religions. And I think there is a group of people who abuse that right to criticize religions, actually to get at people they don't like, who are immigrants, maybe from Pakistan, and it's a form of transference. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem, and so basically racists are using Islamophobia, attacks on Islam to be racists. It's quite hard to prove, because you're talking about people's motives. Another problem, I think, if you look at the Conservative Party, is the way that neoconservative think tanks have formed policy for it. The Henry Jackson Society is one, but I think you can name others, organizations which have structured the way we understand Muslims and structured the way we understand Islam in a way which is very dangerous, and there is a tolerance of discriminatory language about Muslims, which is not about other sections of society. And it's become, quite a lot of it is very mainstream. And all of these issues have come together, I think, and I think there's very little desire, at any rate in the mainstream media, to combat it. Quite the opposite. There's a desire to pander to it. So even very mainstream newspapers, famous papers, feel they can run stories which have contained with them a racist agenda or an Islamophobic agenda. Most recently, we saw, I think, 3 major papers. From memory, it was The Sun, the Mail Online, and the Telegraph, with looks to me like a story about Pakistan exporting COVID to Britain. Seems to have been based on fake numbers and misreported, and it's deeply inflammatory, and it's sending out a message that here are these Pakistanis. I find it very upsetting, and it should not be happening. Another example was the Times newspapers reporting of the Tower Hamlets adoption case, where for 4 days, I think I'm right in saying for 4 days running, the Times splashed on which was a full story, which sent out this message, a dire message about Muslims. Now, these are issues which must be combated, and there is a lack of willingness. Now, my criticism of, as British Prime Minister, you've got to stand up for Britain as a whole, for the society as a whole. And I would love Mr. Johnson to make a big speech saying this stuff is intolerable. And what a message he could send out and it would do him a power of good, by the way, because he would be sending out a message as a national leader, but he won't. And particularly since his own language about Islam has been so regrettable. And not, by the way, just about Islam, about racial minorities. And I can't even bear to use some of the language he has used. So and I think we had made, and I still think we have made, enormous progress in these fields in recent decades. And not just in regards to race, but treatment of homosexuals, who are very, very isolated and exposed and vilified for a long time. But we still stuck in this false, bogus, bigoted narrative, which focuses against Islam. And it's really, and Muslims. And it's something which we have to fight. And I am so dismayed that there is no appetite, ashamed even, that there is no appetite to deal with it inside government at the moment.
Thank you, Peter. Dr. Khadijah, so bringing that, into what we can do or what's happening, we are very aware that, for example, the Conservative Party number 10 policy unit is headed by someone called Munira Mirza. She comes from a Muslim background. We know that the Conservative Party had a chancellor who was Sajid Javid, who comes from a Muslim background. And we know also that the government has started or claims to have started an inquiry into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, led by Professor Swaran Singh. When you see these types of individuals, and many of the people would have certain views, in particular when it comes to Munira Mirza and Swaran Singh, given their own personal background, what do you see as what's happening here? I mean, do you think the impact of appointing Swaran Singh, for example, to run this inquiry shows something about the party, or do you think that the fact that Munira Mirza was chosen as the person to look and identify the Commission on Racism, what does this show about the party and how it's willing to tackle issues of racism?
I think it shows contempt. I think it shows contempt from the Conservative Party and from the government. The track records of all these people is absolutely clear. Somebody like Munira Mirza is on record for absolutely denying that structural racism is an issue. I've seen some fascinating clips of her sort of really pretty much talking down at minorities and Muslims for sort of wallowing in victimhood, as she might put it. And these are narratives that are well known to be peddled by racists, because what they're saying is, people are already facing daily vilification and daily prejudice and discrimination, and it's sort of like kicking them further down, basically, and saying, well, stop complaining about it and stop seeking your rights. And so the appointment of Munir Mirza in that position, the appointment of Swaran Singh, again, somebody who's on record for sort of mocking and scoffing at the idea of Islamophobia, to head a already watered down investigation, after, as you guys have indicated, various promises and commitments. So it's an investigation that's now already lost a lot of its teeth. But to have somebody like that appointed, it's basically saying to Muslim communities, we don't care whether you trust us or not. It's performative of basically a sort of disdain that the Conservative Party and the government have towards Muslim communities and their representative groups and activists. And I think I can't see another way to sort of explain it. Yeah,
I think that one of the weirdnesses of this is that so many of the people who seem to be given senior roles in looking into racism and Islamophobia have written for an organization or a magazine called Spiked. I never read Spiked very carefully, but I understand it's a sort of fringe organ which expresses quite extreme views and inflammatory views about it. Why does the government seem so keen on authors from Spiked magazine? Can anybody explain that? Because it seems to me, if you want to have an investigation into Islamophobia or into all the other noxious problems we suffer as a society, you want to send out reassuring messages to the people who you're trying to, that you're on their side, or at any rate, you're even-handed when you come to deal with these problems. And I don't think, and what they are not doing at the moment is sending out that message. They're sending out the opposite message. And what worries me, and I think is a serious issue, is the briefing we're getting from Downing Street. They're not saying it openly, but they're giving it to reporters. Sebastian Payne in the Financial Times, very respected political reporter, saying that that the government was going to, I haven't got something like, that the Tory government was going to use woke issues to get them going. And I didn't think it meant that in a friendly way. I think it meant that it's going to try and cause division through woke issues. That's incredibly irresponsible. If that briefing to Mr. Payne was accurate, and I know Mr. Payne well, and he's a responsible man, I don't think he would report at something which was false. It was off the record. Now, this suggests that they are trying to stir up divisions. And that is so reckless and irresponsible. I hope it's not true.
Thanks, Peter. So just on that, I mean, we obviously are in a situation where the idea of equal opportunities itself seems to be at risk. I think 30% of people in this country think that equal opportunities have gone too far when it comes to Muslims. So clearly there's this constituency out there for whom, dealing with Islamophobia is really not something that they care about at all. And you rightly said that it should be on the basis of equality. Do you think actually what this shows and what these last few years have shown, in particular, that it's never really about equal opportunities and about fairness and about trying to almost those who are the victims to make them feel included in this inquiry? I mean, it appears that the approach really seems to be, how can we best sweep this under the carpet? How can we make it not a PR disaster for us? I mean, if that's the case, and you know, it'd be good to hear of you, if that's the case, that really they don't care about this constituency, who in the majority don't vote for them, if that's the case, then why is that allowed to happen? I mean, what's allowed this to how have they been able to even downgrade this inquiry, and an inquiry about Islamophobia, put Islamophobia in quotation marks, and in that inquiry about Islamophobia, actually basically refuse to engage with any Muslims outside the ones that they want to do, and do it all privately and not do it publicly, and not actually to highlight the issue of structural racism in the party, but instead only focus on complaints. Like, how has the party been able to get away with this?
Well, the reason the party gets, it's only really speculation, because you're now talking about things you can't actually pin down as facts, but there's no price to be paid for the kind of decisions they're making. As a general rule, the press, the press, by which I mean the Associated Newspapers, the Telegraph newspapers, the Murdoch press, are not concerned with Muslim issues, and if anything, they're very provocative in some of their reporting. So I think they support the government policies which we've been discussing, and I think that it actually, to use the vogue term, it strengthens the base. You know, it appeals to, well, that 50% or more of Tories members who apparently think that Sharia law is, is quite common in Britain. Well, those people are very much reassured. They think, well, that's splendid. You know, these white whinging Muslims, and so there's no, and the papers are not playing their proper role about telling the truth. That is the role of newspapers, is to tell uncomfortable truths. And that instead of which they're playing along with this, particularly with rather ugly stories which spread the idea that, you know, the COVID one recently stuck out there, you know, that Muslims spread disease. I mean, it's which is a noxious, poisonous myth to send out to people who read newspapers and vote Conservative. And so I do feel, this is what I mean, I do feel there's been a nasty, unpleasant, I rather disagree with Khadijah. I think she said you can stretch it a long way back. You can, but there's been a step change in since Johnson arrived as Prime Minister, and the dialogue has become much uglier, and and I think it is a very troubling moment in British history, and I think we have to be very careful in our language, and I think that the government is deeply reckless and irresponsible at the moment in a way it wasn't before.
Could you just, you know, I think it'd be good to get some audience feedback, but just to get your final thoughts on this before we go to the listeners. How do you see that? I mean, following what Peter said, you know, we as a country, we're not America. We don't. I mean, this is not Trump. Trump is significantly worse. I mean, in terms of the words he said, specifically the words he said, the people he's appointed. I mean, the vile hatred that literally Islam is a cancer, and you have someone like that in the top positions in government. I mean, you don't have it being that bad. Our comparisons.
No, I think it's very important to make that. It's very important to make that point, but it is trending now off in that sort of direction, in my view, in a way it wasn't before.
Thanks. Yeah, exactly, Peter. And I think, and also we're not in like Europe. We've got far-right parties in government in places, and you don't have that. But obviously, equal opportunities is equal opportunities. We shouldn't be satisfied with not being as bad as the worst people in the world. Obviously, you know, and you know, Muslim countries which are Muslim majority are probably some of the worst dictatorships in the globe, and so obviously that's not a good comparison. So noting what Peter's been saying and how we highlight this. Some people will say, we've still got it quite good here, haven't we? how would you respond to that, Khadijah? And
yeah, I mean, I agree with Peter in general that, yeah, right now it's very much gloves off. Whereas before there was a sort of the you could tell that there were sort of considerations being taken, even if sort of engagement with Muslims, I mean, has always been problematic. I think I would still stand by that, but I think very much at the moment it is very much gloves off, and we can see that we are, you know, sure we're not in the same place as Trump or the European far right, but we are, as Peter would say, very much trending in that direction. And I think I'd say to that, that point that people make that, well, actually not so bad here, or it's better here than it is in Muslim countries. I think even that, I think has tinges of racism, because it's like, oh, you know, you should be grateful that you're here and that you sort of live here. And I'd have issue with that statement in particular. But I think in general, why are we, you know, we've got to think about where we're placing the bar. What are we measuring ourselves up against? What kind of society do we want to actually be living in? Is it one where we're constantly looking at the worst case scenario and saying, phew, thank goodness we're not living like that? Or is it one where we're actually sort of imagining and aspiring to sort of something that's so much better? And I think for our generation of, you know, I'm born and bred in this country. I come from the background from a Muslim background. That's you know, my faith has always been important to me, important part of my life. There are generations of Muslims who were born and bred in the UK, and how long are we going to keep telling them, well, you know, just be grateful that you know, it's not so bad here? I think these people have every right to imagine and hope and dream for and work for something that's far more equitable, and that treats them fairly along with other citizens. So yeah, I'm very dissatisfied with that approach that tells us, you know, well, it's not as bad as Trump.
Thank you, Dr. Khadijah.
Although I do think it is also important to say that, I mean, I'm very encouraged. I quite often meet groups of young Muslim people, because I go and talk at universities or at colleges, and I'm so impressed. And there are opportunities out there, and I don't want to. It would be wrong to say you haven't got a chance or anything like that. You do, you know, there are pathways through. I mean, for instance, at the Daily Mail, I used to have a column for. I think quite a high percentage of the current graduate intake people are Muslim. I was very struck by that. I mean, so even in the Mail, which is very much it's quite often slotted as being part of the forces of darkness, I was really struck. I think I met a couple of very able young Muslim journalists who obviously going to be amazing. And I always say to them, actually, I just concentrate on journalism for the time being, learn your trade. And I mean, I really do feel that you don't want to come into the world age 22 full of grievances. You want to get on with your job, and when you're a more senior figure, you can start, you know, respected in your trade or profession, and you can use the authority you have from that to start to make political points. But that said, and so I do think that we don't want to get too dark about it. But I am very, very upset with the language of this government and the way it is dealing with these very important issues.
Thank you. A lot of people seem to be asking this broad question, which is, what can we do about it? What can Muslims do about it? And but actually, before we go to that, there's related to what you just mentioned. Someone just asked, the media plays a huge role in the understanding of Muslims by the British public. Mainstream journalism is 97% white and 0.4% Muslim, and it is detrimental. And it seems to be detrimental for Muslims in those environments to voice opposing views. So to Peter, how many good guys like yourself are there who are also willing to go public and actually call out the Islamophobia that's there?
Well, I don't know about. I think it's an important thing to do. There's not enough. There's an argument to be had. And I do think that there are some very good things. You have used ipso, but it certainly could be stronger, but I think the way you have used ipso to force corrections and apologies from papers which make errors has been very effective. That's new. The old Press Complaints Commission wasn't nearly as as strong. I do see a wave of a generation of new Muslim journalists. I meet quite a few of them. They're very good. And I do think it is important, not that they should go into the profession. This is the world I know, as somebody who telling Muslim stories. I think they should go in there as a British journalist and learn their trade, doing all the usual things, and not being an activist. I mean, there's room in the world for being activists, but I really think and I do think if you go in there, get your head down, you're gonna go ahead and get on in life and become a really powerful voice and example as well in the future.
Okay, and Khadijah, a lot of people have been asking, what should we do in different ways of asking that question. We've also had one question saying, what should MPs do, from Naz Shah, MP who's listening in. Like, what should we do? I mean, if we're saying that there is a serious problem, it's not as bad necessarily as elsewhere. Some people argue, whatever. That's not really the point, though. But what should we do to make it better? And you know, as Muslim communities or as individuals, as humans, you know, what can we do about it? There's also another 2 or 3 questions have asked this very similar background.
Yeah, so I think my main point that I want to drive through in response to that is that we've talked about how this government really thrives on exacerbating divisions between whether it's between Muslim activists, and we've seen that very plainly in terms of demonizing certain trends and tendencies and groups and individuals, and sort of classifying them as beyond the pale, and therefore by default forcing Muslims who do want to engage to disassociate themselves publicly from these groups, but also more generally in society. You know, it fosters divisions by, you know, for instance, talking about the white working class, this idea of a disenfranchised group that's in poverty, that maybe, you know, we're neglecting the white working class, and by doing that they sort of undermine the very real solidarity and coalition, and actually sort of the fact that race doesn't really matter for people who are in working class situations in the way that the government indicates through this kind of rhetoric. So division is a major weapon that I think really bolsters some of the most dangerous policy directions that we've seen over the past year or so. And I think the main takeaway that I would say is that anybody who does want to make a difference or wants to push back against this very dangerous trend that we're seeing is to not allow themselves to fall into that trap, basically. Don't let the current political situation, don't let it divide you. Sure, we all have differences, and even, you know, within Muslim communities there are various differences, and, you know, political tendencies, religious tendencies, sectarian tendencies, and issues like that. And beyond that, again, within our communities. But what's the most important thing at hand, I think, is something that should unite us all. And I think, you know, looking out for the most vulnerable in our societies is something that I would hope unites all of us, whether it's from people who are MPs in Parliament or people sort of doing grassroots activism in their local area. So I think not giving mind to this kind of to the kind of language that fosters division, exacerbates division in our communities, is definitely an important aspect of organising and activism that we need to pay heed to.
Agreed. So how do we, either of you, Peter or Dr. Khadijah, we've had a lot of different questions about the response of individuals and communities and how we should respond, or MPs. But specifically, let's get to the particular issue when it comes to Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, given that's quite a focus here. How, like, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has made an interim decision, at least, not to investigate the party and not to conduct an inquiry. They're obviously waiting for the internal complaints assessment that the Conservative Party is doing. But what should communities do? That was literally, I think, the first question that came on our Q&A. What should we write to them? Like, how do we ensure that the voices of Muslim communities are heard in the public sphere perhaps comparably to other communities? I mean, Peter, I think maybe this is one for you. I mean, is it because media organizations don't seem to, at the moment, care about Islamophobia? How can we change that? And one argument that you've obviously talked about is, more Muslims are getting involved in media, and obviously that's a long-term importance, because it's always important to have representation, and when you have a large number of people there, then hopefully that will reflect diversity on the ground. But friends of mine have told me how they've been at editorial meetings where really hostile things about Muslims have been talked about, and they just had to raise a question. They didn't want to, because they didn't want to be the Muslim person, but they raised questions saying, that doesn't seem right. Can we just check out if it's true or not? And it was found out not to be true. But putting that aside for a moment, like, what can we do given where we are right now? I mean, we don't want to be in too much of a negative, approach to this. How can we what can we do positively to make a difference and to help ensure that voices of Muslim communities, in particular when it comes to Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, but also more broadly, how can we do that?
I think that Muslims, by the way, if you look at the surveys done of Muslim attitudes, they're very British, patriotic, public-spirited, family-minded, very good in running businesses, and I think that message needs to be got across. I do also think that we need to, and you do this incredibly well. History will give you an honored place, Miqdaad, in exposing the lies. And and I think before we finish this, I think we must, I've been looking at the questions, the chat. One of the, there's one person raises Trojan horse, the issue of the schools in Birmingham. And one of the biggest indicators of the Islamophobia in the British press and the Conservative Party has been that wretched Trojan horse affair, which was represented as a conspiracy of Islamists to capture East Birmingham schools. We now know that from Professor Homewood's book and from the findings of the Education Committee, I think it was, and the failure of the tribunals, that this was a fabrication got up together by the British press and by politicians, above all Michael Gove at the Department of Education, to vilify very public-spirited Muslim teachers who had done incredible work. And by the way, not just Muslim teachers, lots of Christian teachers. I mean, but the teachers at those schools had done an incredible job. And I think that we need to tell the truth about how the conspiracy must have come from the other side, to tell lies about these fabulous schools and the damage it's done to the careers of 20 or more teachers, the life chances of the children who've seen these schools, the standards fall so much after these new teams were sent in to replace the old teams. Trojan horse is a terrible scandal, and the fact that the British press has not seen fit to report on it is I think we need to get understanding of issues like that. So it's very important, the understanding of the basic barbaric, really, unfairness of the political and the media reaction to the so-called Trojan horse affair is understood. And there are other grave injustices, like the Tower Hamlets case I was referring to earlier, which really we need to, these myths put out there against Muslims need to be systematically challenged.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our hour. I mean, it has been really a fascinating discussion, having both of you from different perspectives and different insights and expertises coming together and sharing your thoughts on this really important issue. It's been a year of this Prime Minister, and we have probably many years to come. And I think it would be good to have some closing thoughts from both of you, maybe thinking about the way forward. What's going to happen in this next year? What do you see as the next year that's going to happen, for us, and how can we, what should we do? So, a couple of minutes each would be great to just see your final thoughts. Maybe Dr. Khadijah, if you start, and then Peter.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such an uncertain. I mean, we're only halfway through 2020, and it feels like it's been a decade already. So it's a really volatile and uncertain time because of so many different factors. And I think we've at the moment the focus very much is getting through the pandemic as safely as possible. But we shouldn't forget obviously that Brexit is still happening as well, and the government has really shown no sign of revising its approach in terms of engaging with Muslim communities, engaging with issues around Islamophobia in particular. I mean, Peter talked about the idea that the government wanted to sort of get involved in using woke issues, to put it in inverted commas. I think this is something that we've already seen in Muslim communities in terms of how government agencies from the Home Office have chosen to use issues that I think the young activist generations hold dear to themselves. So whether it's stuff like BLM, I noticed that's come up in the discussion quite a lot, but also things like women's agency and equality. These are all issues that we've seen agencies from the Home Office actually set up or fund or support groups to put out government compliant messages and messaging to communities through. And I think it's for activist groups, I would say in terms of the year ahead, just be conscious of the fact that we shouldn't. I mean, while it's a great thing and it's absolutely everybody's right to seek to engage formally with the government, be conscious of the fact that there are so many arenas and so many platforms that people can and do make their voices heard, and don't restrict yourselves to one or other. I think the search for coalition and solidarity with other like-minded people on shared aims, I think, is something that you can't that can't be sort of underestimated in terms of its potency and its power. And I think this is the time more than any for unity and shared platforms between people. So I think that's something that should definitely be explored and utilized as much as possible.
Thanks. And Peter, thank you very much for your thoughts. And what do you think? What are your closing remarks on this session? People have been. We just had a comment saying we need more Peter Obornes. Yes, that would be great.
So I agree so much of everything that Khadijah was saying there about the wider activism. I think the question with the Tory party specifically, and I want to address Hasina Momtaz's question to panelists 10 minutes ago, is that whether or not it's worth bothering with the Conservative Party. It may be that they are simply not interested, and the way they have conducted themselves with, yes, maybe they aren't. But I mean, I think, of course, you should go through the motions, but is the party of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings going really to have anything worthwhile to say to Muslims? I think that's an open question. I definitely think that the Labour Party has an immense opportunity. We need to see Labour as emerging, not just in the issue of Islamophobia, but across all kinds of issues, as a moral force, as a great moral force in British politics, as it has been in the past. And I do think that the Labour has an opportunity to speak very powerfully on these issues, and I think also it may be worth talking to the middle-of-the-road decent Tory MPs who've been flung out of the Conservative Party for not accepting the diktat of Cummings/Johnson. I mean, for instance, Dominic Grieve, the Beaconsfield MP who was flung out, he, of course, chaired the Islamophobia Commission, which, is that what it was called, which I sat on a couple of years ago. And I think that you can form, I think it is a unique time, actually, to get the message out to form cross-party alliances, and to confront what is, and by the way, it's worth bearing in mind that the Conservative Party message is very bleak, not just on the issue of race, not just on the issue of Islamophobia, but on across all kinds of issues. Essentially, what we have is a great battle for decency in this country. And part of that battle for decency is the battle against Islamophobia. And so I think there's a wonderful opportunity, a hopeful opportunity to form alliances to save the idea of Britain, which I believe Cummings/Johnson are in danger of, want to destroy.
Thank you so much to both of you. And Khadijah, obviously many people saying we need more Khadijahs too. So this is a fantastic panel of both of you. And thank you so much for your insights. Lots of people have come back with, really appreciating and your insights and your thoughts. It's really a pleasure to have had you here, an honor to have had you both sharing your thoughts and on this really important topic for British Muslims. And this is our first webinar of this type that we've had recently, and hopefully we will have more of these in the future. And it was a great pleasure for that you have been the first to have done it and participate. So thank you, both of you, and thank you to all the attendees and participants, whether through Facebook, watching it live, or directly here on Zoom. And I look forward to speaking to you and sharing some thoughts with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.